Hello. Is it on? Dear colleagues, participants, you are welcome to this session. The session is on decolonizing political theory, decolonizing political theory. And your chairperson is Sabit Makara from the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, Makerere University. That is me. We have 5 presenters or panelists. We have Doctor? Oh, there's no titles, because even me, I didn't say I have any title. No titles. Oluwatosini Orimolade from Nigeria. Put up your hand. Yes. We have Miss, she's Anna Kasika from India, the only lady on the panel. We have Jacob Katumsime from Uganda. Put up your hand. We have Joseph Jemberi from Ethiopia. We have Aventino Banjwa from Uganda. Mentioning the country is just to beef it up and to make it a bit stylish. It doesn't matter where the scholar comes from, because scholarship is really universal. So it doesn't matter where you're coming from, whether India or Pakistan or UK or Uganda, but I was just trying to spice it up so that you may feel the favor and the flavor of the topic. Our topic is decolonizing political theory. Obviously, if I can steal off 1 or 2 minutes, when somebody mentions theory, immediately what comes to the minds of some young people, especially the ones we teach, is that you are now going to deal with a very difficult subject. So some of the students actually try to dodge papers which have the word theory in them. Unfortunately, here at Makerere, most of the theoretical papers are actually core. And it's purposeful because people who design courses have an intention of making sure that the students grasp the basic things about the subject matter. Because one professor, unfortunately he demised, he told us at one time that if you don't have theory, you are dealing with juakari. Juakari means just being in the sun there and you are beating a few metals or trying to create something without foundation. Therefore, in many universities, the foundation of scholarship really is theory. It doesn't matter where you start. You may start from pre-colonial times and you theorize. You may start from the colonial times, especially for us who have gone through the periods of colonialism. You may theorize colonialism. But now in this case, I think the panel is about looking at how you decolonize society that was colonized at one time. How successful or how unsuccessful we are, it depends on how my panelists really take on the subject matter. If I had a chance also to speak, I would obviously join them, but I cannot join them because I'm the chairperson. But I'll take advantage of being the chair to come in here and there to really spice it up and also to ask people to get involved in the discussion. I'm not going to waste any of your time. I'm going to begin from the last person. We have 5 panelists, but I want to start with the last panelist on my list, number 5, Aventino Banjwa, but I didn't pick their bios. I think I'm going to allow them 1 minute or two to talk about themselves before they present. Let me take this opportunity to call Aventino to articulate his points about epistemological question in African decolonization. You are welcome, sir. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Adventino Panjwa. I'm a PhD fellow at MISA. I'm in my 5th year. It's nice to be here. My paper is titled The Epistemic Question in African Decolonial Scholarship.
I want you to be near the mic.
Okay.
I think there's a way the mic
is structured. Okay. So I'm reading in this paper 2 texts to think about the epistemic question in recent debates in African decolonization. I'm reading the recent paper by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani titled Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities, and an earlier text by another decolonial thinker, Professor Sabero Ndilov-Gasheni, titled Epistemic Freedom in Africa, Deprovincialization and Decolonization. As a privilege, being the first speaker on this panel, I'll digress a little bit. So I'll begin by citing a quote from the Bible that many of you might be familiar with. It is from the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 6, verse 33. It says, "Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all the rest shall be added unto you." Now, as we may all conclude, in this particular verse, Jesus tells us what he thinks should predominate our preoccupations here on earth. That is, we should take all our time in searching for the kingdom of God. Now, if you may think through the debates on decolonization in Africa, in a way we have been grappling with the question, what should come first? What should be given primacy in decolonization? And as you may all know, in the 60s, the debate was on political decolonization. Later, we shifted to the economic question, of course, with the dependence theorists arguing that the economic was not given enough time in thinking about the decolonial question. There was another turn, you may call it the return of the political, in thinking about the decolonial question. And here, the question was, to what extent did we think about the political? Was it enough to get political independence in 1962 here in Uganda, for example? Was it enough to gain the political kingdom? Or was there something beyond the political kingdom that we did not manage to attain? And of course, here the question shifted from thinking about the political kingdom as was obtained at independence to thinking about the nature of the political that was obtained at independence. Now, this is important to think about because the recent debates on decolonizing epistemology or the epistemological decolonial question actually builds on these earlier discussions on decolonization in Africa that begin with the question of the political during the anti-colonial movements, the question of the economic, which was given primacy in later debates championed by the dependence theorists, and of course the return of the political, which was questioning the legacy of colonialism in post-colonial Africa. So as I've said, the recent debate on the epistemic question, which you may frame as the epistemic turn in new colonial studies in Africa, builds on this scholarship, and they all have different takes on why the epistemic is important to think about today and not before. Now, my reading on these debates, I chose two texts. One, as I mentioned earlier, by Professor Sabero, and the recent one by Professor Mahmoud Mamdani. Now, I want to suggest, at a risk of oversimplification, that we may think about these two texts as representing two different ways of looking at the epistemic question in decolonial scholarship in Africa. Let us provisionally call the first, you may call it a school of thought, one that Professor Sabero champions. We may call it the Decolonial Epistemology School. I will elaborate a little bit. And I will call the school that Mamdani in his recent work champions, the Epistemic Political Decolonial School. Now, on the one hand, the Decolonial Epistemology School, one that Professor Sabero and the decolonial thinkers, Professor Sabero is writing from the tradition that we call, or we may call, the coloniality, decoloniality, modernity school, which emerges in Latin America. So here the project argues for the unquestionable existence of true African knowledge systems and epistemes, and by the same token, the existence of Western Euro-American knowledge systems and epistemology, or what we generally call the modern epistemology. So we draw a distinction here that there is an existence of African knowledge systems and the modern epistemology. According to this school of thought, the most enduring colonial wound is the epistemic wound, registered through what is called the colonial epistemicides, linguicides, and the like. It is argued that colonial states and their successors after political independence, or what is called here the logic of coloniality, have been successful in dispelling African knowledge systems and epistemes, but only to the point of subjugation, domination, and othering. In other words, there was no total defeat of these knowledge systems. It seems to be the case that in this school of thought, that if colonialism mounted its central point of attack on the mental universe of the colonized, emptying its original content, and most important, so emptying the colonized mind of all its original content, the idea here is that the most important aspect of decolonization in 21st century Africa is the epistemological decolonization. So, as you may see, the dictum by Kwame Nkrumah during the anti-colonial movements that seek the political kingdom first is reversed in this rendering of the epistemic question. And Professor Sabero declares that seek ye first the epistemic freedom. Seek epistemic freedom first, with the implicit extension that the rest will be added onto you. Now, the other school of thought that I read in this text is the one that Professor Mamdani champions in his recent work, which I have provisionally called here the Epistemic Political Decolonial School. And of course here, Mamdani is trying to link his earlier work on political decolonization with the question of epistemology. If colonial political modernity, as we have read in Mamdani's earlier works, ushered into Africa a political model predicated on the existence of permanent majorities and permanent minorities, our post-colonial, decolonial, intellectual and political movement, Mamdani has recently argued, has to enjoin, and I quote, the epistemic and the political in a mutually productive endeavor. The epistemic project both yields changes in policies and follows a change in how we see ourselves in the world. Decolonization of the political means upsetting the permanent majority and minority identities that define the contours of the modern nation state. The idea of the nation state naturalizes majority and minority identities, justifying their permanence. Of course, the question that emerges from this rendering is how exactly does the dialectic of the epistemic and the political work in actual decolonial struggles. And on this, Mamdani has argued that like Marxist theory, decolonial theory too gets decolonization backward. Not only does the political precede the social, you may read the economic, I argue that the political is twinned to the epistemological. The first question at independence, he argues, was not how to distribute wealth, but who belongs. And he suggests that answering this question of belonging is in a productive way necessitates decolonizing the political. So Mamdani here tries to link the epistemic question to the decolonial question and argues that we cannot pursue these projects independently. The epistemic question has in a way to be linked to the political question, of course, in his case, of decolonizing or rethinking identities that were rendered permanent minorities and permanent majorities. Now, we can see clearly that there is a shared ground in these two ways of thinking about the epistemic question. We know that both Professor Mamdani and Professor Sabero are rooted in what Sabero has called the epic school on the study of colonialism in Africa, where the argument is that colonialism was fundamental and it was transformative. So the point I'm making here is that they share a lot of ground, but they also have divergences. And my point in reading these texts is that the political theoretical implications in pursuing the decolonial project today, so if you choose to look at the epistemological question as a standalone question, one that looks for African knowledge systems that were subjugated, of course you will take a different route than when you look at these two projects as linked together, whereby the epistemological in a way faces the political. So as I conclude, I think we need to think through the theoretical and political implications on where we turn. If we look at the epistemological question as an independent question, we may end up searching for pre-colonial realities that should be brought to life today. On the other hand, we may look at the epistemological question as directly implicated in political struggles in Africa today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adventino, for your serious engagement of this debate. I'm not going to summarize. I'll do that when I'm calling for discussion. I wanted us to hear all the presenters. You take down notes of a particular person you want to address your issues later on, so that all of them present, and then we address our questions to them afterwards. So I want to take this opportunity to invite another presenter. This time, number one, Orimolade from Nigeria. You're welcome.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Oluwatosin Orimolade. I'm a PhD a fellow at the Makerere Institute of Social Research. And today I want to reflect on what I title the perils and dilemmas of political decolonization in Nigeria. So basically, what I want to look at is the different dilemmas, different challenges that nationalist elites and post-colonial elites in Nigeria faced as they sought to pursue certain kinds of political projects. So for my purpose, I identify 4 decolonial moments in the political history of Nigeria. The first took place against the backdrop of the racialization of the states in Nigeria, especially the Crown Colony state in Lagos, at the end of the 19th century. The emergent anti-colonial movement, in response to the growing racialization of the state, would envision a new political community that would embrace the entire English-speaking West Africa. In its explicit objectives, it was against the movement for territorial self-government. It envisioned the British Empire as a commonwealth of equal citizens. And one of the key figures in this movement was Nnamdi Azikiwe. I will talk more about him in the course of the presentation. The second decolonial moment took place against the backdrop of the imposition of the indirect rule system in the eastern provinces of Nigeria in the 1920s. It was essentially a women-led movement. And this movement sort of wanted a return to the pre-colonial political organizations that were unsettled with the introduction of indirect rule. So they regarded the new system of native administration introduced by the colonial states as a form of power that empowered chiefs to act as sole executives in communities without histories of chiefship, extended the reach of the power of chiefs over villages, put together tribes without ancestral or informal connections under newly imposed chiefs, disempowered recognized elders and title holders, and so forth, and so on and so forth. The third decolonial moment, will take place in the 1940s and 50s in the context of the rise of territorial nationalism. It was marked by the attempt to evolve broad-based nationalist movements that would unite so-called natural tribal communities cultivated under indirect rule, reconcile rural and urban inhabitants, capture the interests of tribal unions and labor movements as a means to forge a modern state, and also entrench common citizenship. to propose a new state structure that would reorganize the state on geographical and demographic considerations rather than on ethnic basis. The political objective of the movement was aimed at the restoration of political power and economic resources to the people of Nigeria, and the assertion of the sovereign right of the people to determine the form of their political constitution. So I mentioned Nnamdi Azikiwe earlier, and Nnamdi Azikiwe played a key part as the major frontliner in the mobilization and the galvanization of a broad-based movement. Nnamdi Azikiwe is actually very indicative of the perils and dilemmas of the struggles for decolonization, as I will show earlier, as I will show later, because he had started out his political career as a Pan-Africanist who was interested in more or less mobilizing racial consciousness amongst black people. He went to the United States to study in the 1920s and would become a leading part of the Pan-African movement. He becomes influenced by Marcus Garvey and among others, and would return to Africa with the hope that the whole of the continent can more or less be mobilized racially against colonial rule. He was quite starry-eyed, quite idealistic. He would apply for civil service jobs in Liberia, apply for civil service jobs in Ethiopia, and was met with outright rejection of his offer, of his interest in the project for a deterritorialized project of a deterritorialized aspiration, rather, for more or less a broad-based African state, if you can put it that way, or a one African state. It would make a switch to become part of the nationalist movement in Nigeria. The Nigerian army would launch a plan to unify the country under a unitary constitution as a framework for promoting national unity. It would abolish ethnic regionalism, attempted to reorganize the country geographically, and attempt to detribalize state and society. So, I make a distinction between the first two decolonial moments and the latter two decolonial moments. The first decolonial moment, to return to the first momentarily, was forward-looking, and it envisioned a British Commonwealth of racial equality and equal citizenship. More or less, the first decolonial moment wanted to reform the British Empire. The second was animated by a desire to restore pre-colonial political organizations. My thinking is that broadly, both decolonial aspirations were anti-colonial and represented radical pathways for breaking out of the nation-state form. The latter two, in contrast, were contained within the framework of territorial nationalism, and as such, were faced with the practical dilemmas of what aspects of the colonial legacy to accommodate or reject. So let me take a look at the dilemmas that confronted the latter two decolonial projects. So in the 1940s, as Nnamdi Azikiwe attempted to mobilize a broad-based movement that would galvanize both urban and rural inhabitants, and as well as create a new state form more or less, that would challenge the legacies of colonialism, the legacies of a tribalized and ethnicized political society. One of the major one of the major foundations for that movement was the attempt to abrogate chieftaincy institutions. Nnamdi Azikiwe would argue that chieftaincy institutions were the very basis for the tribalization and ethnicization of political society. And so to decolonize the Nigerian state, he thought that it was important to abrogate chieftaincy institutions. Now, this was a very tricky and slippery terrain because throughout colonial history, the assumption is that while the educated intelligentsia represented urban inhabitants, rural inhabitants, in contrast, were represented by their native chiefs. The challenge, therefore, is if Nnamdi Azikiwe was going to mobilize the countryside for this, to be part of this broad-based movement, then he needed the cooperation of native chiefs in the attempt to forge a broad-based community. Invariably, the point, therefore, is that the attempt to abrogate chieftaincy institutions would subsequently reinforce the very urban-rural divide that Nnamdi Azikiwe wanted to bridge. It would therefore deepen social tensions between the urban intelligentsia and native rulers. So the real dilemma here, therefore, is, do you abrogate the native institutions and thereby lose the social base of the country in the countryside, or enter an alliance with native chiefs, in which case the project was bound to perpetuate colonial legacy? The second dilemma was faced by both the third and the fourth moments. But I would highlight the fourth moment as most representative of this dilemma. After the January coup in Nigeria in 1966, the new military ruler, Aguiyi Ironsi, would attempt to undertake a project of national unity by introducing a unitary constitution, creating a unified civil service, abrogate tribal movements, introduce residency as basis for identification, obviate the need to enter a place of origin as a requirement for government jobs. The agenda was quickly opposed by pro-tribal and ethnic forces, especially in northern regions of the country. They argued that while they were not in principle against the plan to unify the country, such a plan was likely to favor the most advanced sections of the country, especially in the south, which was and is still believed to be the economically and educationally advanced region of the country. And as such, the nation-building project that Ironsi envisioned had to be, and as such, they thought, this was those who opposed this project, they thought that the nation-building project of Ironsi had to be preceded by heavy government investment in the northern part of the country to socially and economically place the north at par with the south. The consequence of this opposition, the opposition to this project grew in Nigeria, was that it set in motion the conditions that led to the death of Ironsi in the hands of soldiers who mutinied against his regime, and ultimately set in motion the immediate conditions that led to the Nigerian Civil War. Let me skip the third dilemma for a moment and try to conclude. So, if you take the examples of Nnamdi Azikiwe and Aguiyi Ironsi, both representative of third and fourth decolonial moments, My argument is that they highlighted the delicate and combustible nature of projects with decolonial potentials in deeply ethnicized political society. In the case of Nnamdi Azikiwe, despite being at the epicenter of the attempt to establish a mass-based movement, his attempt to abolish institutions of chieftaincy would lead to the loss of critical social base in the movement for independence. The rural peasantry, which at the time constituted more than 90% of the country's population. When the project of ethnic nationalism was instituted, Azikiwe's political stature was subsequently demeaned from a nationalist hero to a regional and ethnic patriot. In the case of Agoyin Ironsi, he would pay the ultimate price with his life as soldiers from the northern region of the country eventually mutinied against his regime, leading to his death in July 1966. So let me conclude by making 2 points. So my intention here has been to highlight the concrete historical circumstances and dilemmas, conundrums that confronted these political projects, and how these dilemmas appear to have denuded these projects of their very decolonial potentials. I think drawing from the lesson of these experiences, the colonization of a state cannot proceed on the basis of prescriptive arguments, that is, the one-size-fits-all arguments that states how exactly the colonial projects should proceed. I think that what is required is a political theory that begins with actual historical experiences, real existing dilemmas and conundrums, and that further helps to illuminate the actual historical events themselves. Thank you.
As I said earlier, we are not going to do the summary now. I'm going to call in the third presenter, then we give ourselves enough time to respond to their issues or to contribute by way of adding or subtracting. I'm now going to call in Ms. Kasika. Okay, come in. Introduce yourself. Yeah,
Thank you.
And subject matter.
Yes, yes. Good afternoon. I want to thank Professor Sabita Makare today because something he started by saying what political theory is and why decolonization is critical in theory, and that was very lucid because my topic today is about ambivalence of colonial bodies, and I'm reading the early women's magazines written in the language, my language, spoken in the southwest state of Kerala. It's a tiny state in India. While this paper has already been once presented in a cultural studies program, I thought it's also evidently necessary to raise this topic, the conceptual arc of this paper, in the political theory. Why? Because, I'm going to start that. The idea of political theory itself, as it's derived from the European philosophical preoccupations, firmly locates itself in the West, territorially and conceptually, and this theory has been presented over centuries as both universal and objective. In response to both the loss and exile of the non-Western traditions of knowledge, political theory ought to rethink epistemologies. I think the previous two presenters and my other colleagues are going to present exactly what these epistemologies mean for them in different contexts and in different situations and for different people and different communities. So in doing so, the universality and the objectivity of political theory need to be disrupted in understanding the relevance of political theory to the larger social and political world. That is, from rethinking what a canonical and non-canonical text of political theory to countering the hegemonic productions of racialized and gendered and colonized subjectivities. And I'm retaining colonized in the present world order. Within the material effects of racialized and masculinist, non-propertied hierarchies of political theory. So my question here erupts from the very feminist response to masculinist bias and androcentric nature of history. Now, feminism in itself is questioned as one single category. Now, I'm going to differentiate between single and the particular, but I'm going to keep the singular because of the repetitions of that very term, feminism. So from non-European, non-property people, working classes and non-heterosexual bodies is a question of where the decolonization begins when it comes to political theory. That is the deracialization, or the possibility of deracialization, and the question of gender within the arc of theorizing what is political. Today, as the debate on decolonization of political theories emerged over the last 2 decades, especially in the Western universities, we have seen everything coming to the question, or rather an assumption, acceptance of intersectionality. Now, intersectionality as a term devised by Crenshaw around 1989, it's very recent, given the erasure of histories that we all have experienced under colonialism, whether it's Latin America, Africa, South Asia, even East Asia under Japanese imperialism, that is the Korean Peninsula. But the core argument against intersectionality is critical because from South Asian perspective, and I'm going to refer to Nivedita Menon's piece, which is a 2005 article where she raises the question, is feminism about women? And the core argument rests on the summaries that she eloquently describes imperialism of categories. Certain universal categories, often defined from a Western perspective, are increasingly imposed on non-Western ways of understanding the world. And secondly, a term as popularized by the United Nations and other international agencies. We all know the United Nations did not come into force of what we suffered, or about our color, our ethnicity, our origin, or centuries of violence, epistemic violence, and the bodily violence we faced. It was a consequence of an event of a violence that happened in Europe against Europeans by a European. And thirdly, Menon questions the utility of intersectionality for India, where women's movements have long-standing history of engaging on multiple identities. The identity of women in India, the presumed subject of feminist politics, Menon argues has never been fixed, and it has been constantly destabilized by the politics of caste, religious community, and identity of sexuality, and long history of colonization. And this is not very unlike the histories in Africa, and definitely, I'm very familiar with the work of Oyewumi, who says that the social category of women has been non-universal in the pre-colonial historiography. But we have in our concept, as we presented for this conference, we mentioned a traveling theory and the potential of theory to travel, which brings us to this question of decolonization. Both Edward Said, in his very pioneer essay on traveling theory, and very recently, Professor Mehmet Mamdani has reinforced on this question of traveling theory. So although the travel of theory endures intellectual curiosity, Said warns that theory is a response to a specific social and historical situation of which an intellectual occasion is a part. If intersectionality equates different understanding of the same category, then Maria Lugones' notion of understanding of the experience of gender in Latin America is more critical, where she says, colonialism did not impose pre-colonial. They neither imposed the European gender arrangements on the colonized. It imposed a new gender system that created very different arrangements for colonized males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers, eventually stating that from being a native, a stagnant, a savage, we became a colonial subject, a colonized subject, evidently because our bodies became gendered at some point. And the experience in India of an upper caste, Hindu, masculine notion was that of a womanhood, an ideal womanhood that was preserved in the sanctimonious occasion of within the house. Now, I come from a matrilineal, now this is interesting. I come from a matrilineal family structure, and a matrilineal where women, the lineage, the inheritance comes to women. I keep my mother's name with my name, and my inheritance comes from my lineage is drawn from my great-grandmother, from maternal line. Now, this is evidently perhaps one of the few kinship groups to have been erased by the introduction of colonial legal system anywhere in the world. And for me, tangentially connected to Lugone's observation of gender is the women's literary writings, particularly the women-centered magazines published in my language, is Malayalam, the locally spoken vernacular in a coastal state of Kerala, is very unlike the experiences of rest of India. It was critical in shaping what I conceive as an idea of the modern body in the making of the colonial subject. The term, the modern body, the colonial body, the modern colonial body are alternatively used to refer to the same heteronormative idea of the body which emerged historically since the 19th century in colonial India. The gender characterization of colonized bodies ensued disturbingly intrusive and invasive practices directed on non-procreative, non-normative, non-heterosexual, and alternative bodies and sexualities in an attempt to control sexuality, desire, and possibilities to conceive, to build, to create an ideal British Indian subjecthood. Decolonization of gender therefore endorses a modern social theory of the body, deconstructing this heteronormative discourse of gendered colonial power that stresses on gender and gendering of native colonial bodies as undeniable and concrete tools. Colonial subjects were thus unequivocally gendered subjects who had their bodies enforced with a gendered configuration that had to strictly comply with the heterosexual binary, codes of maleness or femaleness in the performance of their gender. The early women's magazines emerged toward the end of the 19th century, and they flourished in the beginning of early 20th century. So the taking over the British India by the Crown from the East India Company sets in tone for a new world of print culture, publication. It characterized the position of women as gendered colonial bodies within the decline of a matrilineal kinship group, which is unacceptable to the British colonial power. Women having properties, women having the right of the properties, women having right to not be married, because marriage until then was not a monogamous relation arrangement. Women live with their brothers in their own houses, they own the properties. Now, propertied women, as we know in classic political theory, from James Mill to John Locke, we know that it is completely almost unheard in British or Europe in general. The body then, especially in sexual aesthetics and desires, became precarious to the historical project of shaping the modern colonial subject. The discursive public space of these magazines contests the colonial reform discourse in the region, which imposed a new gender and sexual order in shaping governable subjects, publicly articulating the social relationships of colonial time and space. While the colonial body emerged as a discernible object of control, desire, contempt, fear, and fetishism, there is an ambivalence in the vulnerability of critical consciousness through which theoretical discourses about the colonial body is perceived. In the discursive context of colonial heteropatriarchal expectations, the body is ambivalently produced in the abjection and the erasure of the history of the othered bodies. Early women's magazines often exhibit this ambivalence, disrupting the past as ontological dispossession in gender performative colonial bodies. They were subjected, or the colonial or the mental servitude, the colonial mentality had seeped in, wherein the ambivalence in the writing of early women's magazines seemed to be fractured by temporal fissures against a putative, hegemonic, homogeneous, empty time of empire or the nation. And as Dilip Menon has argued, one regime of historicity and one set of protocol were then instituted by the transfer of the Enlightenment project. Within then renter the history of the colony in terms of categories derived from European historical experience. These magazines were being read as sites with critique, not as a critique of Eurocentric social theory, but as a part of the categories of conventional historiography. These magazines often act as a local archive, accounting for their role as sites of archival presence, refuting any speculation of conspiracy of silence. Needless to say, these archives, mostly elapsed or seldom retrieved, acknowledge the epistemic limits of archival knowledge in recognizing the conceptual history of the colonial body as a social fact. Reading them offer a limited archival hermeneutics in reorienting the image of the body. Early women's magazines often exhibit archetypical incongruity, disrupting the past. And as Anjali Arundekar has often argued, that sufficient attention is not often cast on how archives in themselves are segregated and composed, which she describes in her own project as an archival hermeneutics that assemble reading practice adequate to the writing and survival of a robust and ethnic, queer, and colonial historiography. Hence, the historical project of shaping the idea of the 2 minutes? Modern body in the making of colonial subjects have often seen an ideal making of the ideal man and the ideal woman. And the modern redefinition can be discerned in the sexual imageries of these womanhood as presented in these magazines. And finally, these magazines seem to reckon with an almost ambivalent autobiographical voice, with the magazines reflecting upon the intertextual commentary, flexing the structure to echo their life processes to establish continuity. They reinforce the colonial composition of social categories, of monogamous marriage, cohabitation, deviancy, as directed by the colonial archetype, which indirectly slipped into normative contestations about cultural alterity lodged in the gendered bodies of colonial subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for a very articulate presentation on ambivalence of colonial bodies. I think members have followed very well the argument. I shall have a time to recap, but not to say everything you have said. May I call upon Joseph Jemberi from Ethiopia to come and present your point. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. So today I am going to share.
Repeat your name.
Oh, all right. So, okay, Prof. So my name is Yosef. I come from the Horn of Africa, particularly from Ethiopia. And today I am here to share with you part of my PhD project. And in the context of this conference, what I'm going to do today is provide a provisional critique of the idea of sovereignty in the Horn of Africa. So this critique is going to be what we call a denaturalizing critique. And it is not just a critique of sovereignty, it is mainly a critique of mainstream theory of sovereignty by Western thinkers from Jean Bodin, Thomas Hobbes, Carl Schmitt, to Walter Benjamin, Michel Foucault, and Giorgio Agamben. But it's going to be a historical critique. So what is this historical argument that I'm making, and which I hope to be a critique of the idea of sovereignty. So the central argument is this. In Ethiopia, sovereignty or modern state power emerged in the transition from what I call Nagaret. This is a pre-modern mode of power. From Nagaret to sovereignty during the first half of the 20th century. From 1930 to 1944. This was the time when modern power emerged in Ethiopia, which means the transition from a pre-modern type Nagaret power to sovereignty took place. This period from 1930 to 1944 was shaped by three historical movements. The first movement is an internal process. It's largely a domestic process. So what happened in this first movement? In this first movement, the diverse and contested field of 19th century Ethiopian political tradition was manipulated and reappropriated by Imperial Haile Selassie's political modernity. This is a purely domestic, not purely, but largely a domestic process. The two other movements are mainly external and, if you may, colonial interventions or colonial projects. The first of these two subsequent movements is from 1935 to 1941. A period some people call Italian occupation, but we at Miser would like to call Italian colonialism. Italian colonialism in Ethiopia interrupted the first process attempted by Haile Selassie to modernize politics. The Italians administratively and juridically fragmented the Ethiopian state and incorporated it into what they call Italian East Africa, along with Eritrea and Somalia. This is the second movement. The third movement immediately follows this period, from 1941 to 1944, what we call British military administration of occupied enemy territories, including Ethiopia, Somalia, and Eritrea. This is a period often neglected in the literature, but it is critical in the making of modern power in Ethiopia. So the British wanted to undo Italian colonial structure. To use their word, they wanted a return to the Ethiopia of the 1935. That is the first movement when Haile Selassie was trying to politically modernize Ethiopia. But the British effort rather gave to the 1950s imperial Ethiopian sovereignty. Beginning of the 1960s, the historical trajectory of modern power have been shaped in Ethiopia by the struggle between and among two claims of sovereignty: state nationalism and ethno-national ethno-nationalism. So from the 1960s all the way to the present, modern power has been shaped by the struggle between state nationalism and ethno-nationalism. My argument is that both claims of sovereignty, state national sovereignty and ethno-national sovereignty, are derivative of the preceding two colonial projects, the Italian and the one supervised by the British. Both claims lack historical agency, which sublates in any form colonial experience. They recycle colonial experience, state nationalism and ethno-nationalism. So, to give a brief methodological expose of this argument, I started with a particular contemporary problem in Ethiopia. And that is a question, that is the question of sovereignty and state of emergency. The present war in Ethiopia witnessed declarations of 3 overlapping states of emergency. The first one was declared by the national regional state of Tigray, and it's called National Regional State of Emergency. The second was declared by the federal state of Ethiopia, and it is called Federal State of Emergency. But then there is a third ambiguous declaration, which I am not sure we can call state of emergency, but for lack of a better word, I translated it as state of mobilization, and it's called Kitet Awaj. This one was declared by various groups, including the ethno-national states, 2 ethno-national states, Tigray and Amhara. It was also declared by the Ethiopian states itself, but then it was also declared by numerous, several lower-level administrative localities. So the question I asked is that why this overlap of state of emergencies? My argument is that even if this overlap should be understood within the context of post-1991 Ethiopian political context, it should be read through the lens of the broader 20th century history of political modernity in Ethiopia. So, since 1964, about 11 states of emergencies were states of emergency were declared in Ethiopia, and 7 out of the 11 states of emergency declared in Ethiopia since 1964 were declared because of armed conflicts between the Ethiopian state and Somali, Eritrean, Tigray, and Oromo nationalist resistance groups. So state of emergency in Ethiopia has been a field of struggle between state nationalism, between and among, not just between and among state nationalism and ethno-nationalism. But the question of state of emergency and sovereignty actually began in Ethiopia during the British military administration of occupied enemy territory, including Ethiopia. So the form the question of state of emergency and sovereignty took at this particular time during British military administration was the following: how to use state of emergency legislation in order to recognize the sovereignty of Imperial Haile Selassie's Ethiopia without contradicting absolute British military jurisdiction in the country. The answer was provided in Article 9 of the Anglo-Ethiopian Agreement of 31st March 1942. And it says, the Imperial, that is Imperial Haile Selassie, will, at the request of the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, declare a state of emergency and will confer on the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, the British Forces East Africa, the powers of state of emergency. So this is the origin. The lesson of this history, I think, is it denaturalizes the history of sovereignty in Ethiopia, that it does not have a depth of history in the pre-modern. And to decolonize theory of sovereignty means to think beyond sovereignty. It is to think of a mode of political power that sublets ethno-national sovereignty and state-national sovereignty. And my argument is that one inspiration of this decolonial sovereignty is found in Nagaret mode of pre-modern power, which I described in my paper. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Joseph, for your critique of the idea of sovereignty in the case of Ethiopia. As I said earlier, I will not summarize. We want to call upon our other presenter, Jacob Katumsime. He wants to talk almost in the same line about Uganda's nationalist, something like that.
Thank you, Professor Sabit Makara. As we decolonize political theory, choose also must think about decolonizing the idea of time. My paper this afternoon is How Not to Decolonize the Political, a critique of Uganda's nationalist self-determination. You might call this paper also The Pitfalls of Nationalist Self-Determination. Mark that I am not using the word nationalist, I'm saying nationalist self-determination. Jacob Katumsime is my name. I'm a fifth-year student, PhD student at MISA, and I'm glad to see our director seated in the audience and the students and staff. Thank you. So there seems to be consensus in contemporary political theory that decolonization demands destroying the nation state. Political theorist Professor Mahmoud Mamdani has illustrated that these two objects, state and nation, are necessarily incompatible, for the purpose of the state is to apply the law equally to all members, while the purpose of the nation is to protect and valorize only members of the nation. So, whereas popular intellectual consensus therefore seems to agree that to democratize is to dismantle the nation state, there seems to be discrepancy on how to move forward. At MISA, we have been debating, does decolonization mean the rejection of everything Western, everything that is modern? What political futures do we imagine after dismantling the nation state? So, two major imaginaries seem to compete as alternative paths after dismantling the nation state and the move to institute a new political order. So, whereas on the one hand is a call to rid the state of the nation, on the other is a call to rid the nation of the state. And it's this move, calling for the total destruction of the state and salvaging of the nations, that I refer to as nationist. This nationist call is not limited to Uganda, but seems to be a global call in especially the formerly colonized world. So in this discussion, I limit myself to interrogating the assumptions of Uganda's nationalist public. So this nationalist public, I must say, is not homogeneous in thinking, but I shall deal with elements in their intellectual coherence. So this nationalist public had thoughts of several public intellectuals, both women and men, and we have their intellectuals and scholars like Kalundu Selmaga and my dear brother Bwesige Bwamwesigire. So the nationalist public argues that the nation not only restructures society to pre-colonial settings, but also transforms society into novel forms of freedom from the modern post-colonial state. So the nationalist public argues for the abolition of the Ugandan state and the return to pre-colonial nations. Abolish Uganda, you must have heard that phrase somewhere. So abolish Uganda is popular lingua one encounters on a daily. Many have argued that abolishing Uganda is the antidote to the unresolved questions such as tribalism, nepotism, and the land question. So the nationalist public abhors the use of the linguistic term region in reference to a nation, for example. You know, they tell us we cannot call regions, we cannot call nations regions because regions are a colonial invention. President Bwamwesigire, for example, has said that it's reducing sovereign peoples into sections of a prison. So to break away from this prison, the nationalist public has argued that we should abandon the Ugandan national anthem, for example. It should go along with the Ugandan state. That we should return to our pre-colonial nations. So whereas the nationalist valorizes the nation as a pre-colonial entity, Mamdani has observed that nation is the term that modernity, that is the European colonial and post-colonial moments, used to describe the group deemed civilized, and the state is the legal apparatus it uses to achieve its ends. Whereas the nationalist would argue that he wants to do away with the state, the privilege of the majority would remain. Mark that. In fact, to think of it, the nationalist only wants to create independent nation states within the state. More so, the nationalist aversion of the state is not so much because he locates a serious problem with it, except that he often feels robbed by the ruling elite, and thus the ruling elite is imagined as uninterested in providing services to the society except their clansmen. So what do the nationalists say, for example? They say that this ruling elite is a property of the colonialists and together with the state. So we should do away with this state. Ironically, I notice the nationalist often doesn't talk about the institutions of the state, such as the army, the civil court, and the chief. And it is more so very interesting how the nationalist discourse is so sympathetic to the colonial boundaries within which the state of this state that is being dismantled. The only contention is on how they were marked. If possible, the nationalist only wants to redraw them. The nationalist surely only wants to create nationhood within the institutions of the modern state. But what is nationhood? Mamdani tells us that nationhood is the instrumentalizing of culture for purposes of domination. The nationalist wants domination. What is he doing? He's by demanding this autonomy of different nations. The nationalist is only seeking to multiply the nation states within the borders of the colony. If Uganda is a nation state, he wants to create splinter nation states within, with each ethnic group becoming an independent state. Such a political community, I warn, can only thrive on violence of those who don't belong. Critical political theorists continue to highlight how the nation state cannot guarantee democracy. And the earlier we abandon the project of the nation state, the better for the present and the future. 5 minutes, I think I can. Thank you. So, where do I go? So, let's talk about this return to the nation. The return to the nation is often actually articulated as a federalist demand, where each territory within the colony is given political autonomy. And the autonomy they seek is the power to define who belongs and doesn't belong. The other alternative they have suggested is to have one federation, but still within the colonial boundaries of the would-be abolished Uganda. So, for example, my brother Besije argues that given the fact that most of the nationalities that form Uganda have historical connections to the Nyoro-Kitara Empire, indeed the name Kitara can be considered for this new federation. If we can't call the federation Kitara, the alternative is we call it Kira, since the river Kira or river Nile connects the south of the country to the north. This federation, the proponents argue, would have a new anthem, the major suggestion of which is to be a revised Buganda anthem. The nationist viralizes Buganda's struggles against the state without recognizing their limitations. So for both those who speak of small federations within the unit called Uganda and those who speak of one federation, the intention is one, to tie people to territory. The result shall be the dislocation of those whose ropes of descent cannot firmly tie them around those areas in which they reside. The dislocation of those conceived not to be true sons and daughters of the soil. The groundwork of this nationist demand is in the rising insinuation of the expulsion of those that cannot lay claim to any kingdom or district in the present territory that is Uganda. And the Rwandan and the Indian identity are the most targeted in this regard. If you shall read Ranga Lunyigo's new book, Uganda, an Indian colony, ask yourself the question, what is the political significance of this book? Lunyigo's unwritten answer shall be shocking, and in his recent Miser seminar, he stated it out clearly. Once again, expel them if you can. Asked whether the contemporary Indian in Uganda was a native or a citizen, Lunyigo preferred silence. We have seen in the recent past the Rwandese and Indians demanding to be recognized as tribes of Uganda. And in their 2017 petition to President Museveni, the Indian Association of Uganda decried that their children are born and raised as Ugandans, but when they reach 18 years, they become foreigners. When we ask for national identity cards, passports, and birth certificates, we are required to reveal our tribes, which is a difficult question to respond to. The Rwandese, on the other hand, have mostly denied their Rwandan identity and joined the existing tribes. Others have gone ahead to refashion their identity and want to be identified as Abavandime, because if you say you are a Munyarwanda, then you go to Rwanda and get your passport. Yeah? Let's pause a bit and ask a question. Why are different identities seeking to be recognized as tribes, not necessarily citizens? It's because the tribe has been made the basis for citizenship. Citizenship that doesn't have a distinct tribe behind can be taken away anytime. Examples of Uganda's citizenship cancellations and expulsions abound. The tribe therefore seems to be a guarantor of stability of residence. But what is the content of the conceptual category tribe? To be a tribe means to be pinned to a particular territory within the boundaries of the colonial state. It is interesting thus that the recent demand for tribes in Uganda has not been followed by a demand for territories. But the Rwandan question in Uganda should be a lesson that if you are recognized as a tribe without a territory, your journey into citizenship is still incomplete. That being recognized as a tribe is not enough Because whereas, for example, the Constitution recognizes the Banyarwanda as a tribe of Uganda, the Banyarwanda question has remained a very explosive one. No matter how many names they shall thus refer to themselves with, if they shall still frame self as a political minority, they are recycling the problem. How do we get out of this political crisis? I suggest we turn to Mamdani's theorizing about this question. So let me conclude. In his Neither Settler Nor Native, Mamdani has identified that the challenge facing colonialists is to reimagine political community without colonial categories and reform polities on this basis. Is the nationalist doing that? Ask yourself. You know, he identifies and recognizes that attempts at identifying with the nation are only attempts at seeking power, and not only attempts at seeking power, but also recolonizing the present. Let me make this statement and end. Friends, you've heard me ramble, and the truth is, we cannot produce sustainable societies out of fixing identities to territories. I can most so assure you that each one of us seated here is a cocktail of different identities. No one can lay claim to purity of identity. The project to pin identity to a particular place is futile. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I was trying to write his conclusion. It is quite fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very happy that MISA is doing a very good job. MISA is our own Institute of Social Research. If you see the brand of people who are lined up here, who are presented this afternoon, they are brain-provoking. They are putting up many ideas of new arguments, which I think are very relevant to our times today. And I'm very happy that they come from various countries, including our own. Okay. I understand time is not very much on our side, but we are not going to be intimidated by the timekeeper. Of course, with due respect, but he will give us, I think, maybe some 20 minutes to wind up. I think this has been one of the sessions I've attended in recent times, which is quite provoking, thought-provoking, and we should be given the time to see that we digest what they are presenting. Let me take this opportunity to make some kind of what I have captured in at least one sentence from each of the presenters. The last one was quite provoking with the last conclusion of his presentation on the critique of nationalist self-determination. His conclusion is quite provoking to us in the sense that he says, any attempt to bring identity to a particular place is futile. My question then is, do you destroy the nation state? If you destroy the nation state, what do you remain with in these post-colonial times? And what strategy do you have if you destroy the nation state? What do you stay with? Where do you begin to reconstruct the new nations that you are talking about? This idea that he's presenting seems to resonate with Joseph's presentation on the critique of the idea of sovereignty in Ethiopia. Joseph gave us the trajectory of how power has been built in the Ethiopian state, the challenges that are there. But we have always believed that Ethiopia was not so much colonized like many other African states were colonized, and therefore it could have had a leeway of rebuilding itself as a united country. But as he's presenting, he's saying the country is in tatters. Anytime it can disintegrate, which makes us very much worried. So his idea of critiquing the sovereignty, both of the states and the Ethiopian state, is quite relevant at this time, especially with the situation in Ethiopia today. So what is to be done? I think when you come up at a later time, should tell us. Don't say now things are not working, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, like Chinua Achebe used to say. Tell us the strategy of keeping Ethiopia as one country with various nationalities, as it were. Then our friend
I really gladly enjoyed this discussion. Thank you very much, guys, for the presentations. They were amazing. I have a few questions to... One question? Or I'll okay, I had three, but okay, let me do two. One for the lady and one for the last gentleman. Yes, to the last gentleman, your discussion was very passionate. However, my question is, in your discussion, do you put into consideration social evolution of identities? If we are not identifying as Baganda, Banyankore, Batoro, we are going to identify as Republican or Democrat, either way, and we'll end up in Texas or Washington. So we'll end up in the same place that you say we shouldn't. And then to the lady, the discussion was about gender and the global perspective about culture. In that line, are you putting into consideration the global view in regards to cultural evolution, in that even though you're talking about feminism and the gender challenges in India, feminism is not an Indian movement or an African movement, it's a global movement. So either way, we have to address these challenges at a global level and not in our own communities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, presenters from Maiza. So my question goes to Jacob and then to Yosef. I feel like Yosef didn't have enough time to tell us about what the pre-colonial state was in Ethiopia in regards to sovereignty. So Yosef, what was the pre-colonial state in regards to sovereignty in Ethiopia before that? Then for Jacob, what possibilities do we have towards the adoption of society? Because clearly, if you talk about the nation that you critique, and then the state, which I also think that by virtue of legislating almost on everything within the society, makes everything quite very political. So what are our possibilities towards moving back to society? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Oisa Ivan, a student of Bachelor's of Arts in Social Sciences. My question goes to the last presenter. He was talking about the Indians and the Chinese in Uganda. I have like a question in 2 lines. First of all, is it that Uganda is going back to sign off like we are serfs? We are going to be like serving as serfs the Indians and the Chinese as we allow them to be legalized as Ugandans? Then 2, if we say that we should do away with them, can we really talk about issues of globalization and working together in international relationships? How can we merge the 2? That they don't dominate us, but still we can work with them the best. Thank you so much.
Over to you, Chair.
Yes, please, thank you. Let me call in Anna for 1 minute, and she summarizes her presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the question. I wasn't presenting a paper on global perspective on feminism. In fact, I don't know what global to you is and what global to me is. I was presenting a paper on the conceptual arc of the construction of gender. And as a student of law, and it's very riveting how your question came across to me, I am telling the world that the very construction of gender is a colonial legal import. Why shouldn't I answer that question from where I live, where I read my text? Every text today we have is inanimate. The text become alive from where we read the text, how we read the text. An erasure of my history does not deny me the right to speak from where I am. If the global is what the West says, I'm sorry. That's not why I came all the way from India to Africa to do my PhD in myself. That answers my methodological arc. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me call in Joseph.
So, Professor, you asked me about what's the way forward, the solution, and so on. And Carol's question also resonates that. So my provisional suggestion was to get inspiration from the pre-modern, which I call the pre-modern mode of power, which I provisionally defined as Nagaret. This is a local term. So what do I mean by Nagaret? Nagaret is a relationship of law, political rank, and provisional administration or regional administration between populations, ruling nobility, and the monarchy. And it was in practice in Abyssinia from as early as the 17th century to the beginning of the 20th century. So how do I distinguish Nagaret from sovereignty? So a brief comparison may shed light on what I meant by Nagaret. So sovereign mode of power is fundamentally hierarchical and exclusionary. Nagaret was a mode of pre-modern relationship of power that is primarily functional. The relationship between agents of power is functional, and it's open-ended, or you may call it all-encompassing. So if state of emergency defines the nature of sovereign power, Zamacha, or military expedition in the pre-modern, defines what I call Nagaret. So during military expeditions in the pre-modern, every provincial ruler would beat their war drum, which summoned the entire population of the province. So Nagaret drum addresses everyone, encompasses everyone within that administrative territory. So I don't have time, so we can.
Let me call Let me call my friend, the Nigerian man. He finished?
You asked a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I have much to say. You asked me a question about why I did not speak about the Nigerian Civil War.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not an omission. I wanted to highlight this moment, this decolonial moments, and to speak to the specific challenges that arose at those different moments. You're right that in one of those moments gave rise to the conditions that gave rise to the Nigerian Civil War, but to talk about the Nigerian Civil War would require another paper. Thank you.
Thank you. My friend, on the critique of the nationalist self-determination, could you just have a wrap? I think you didn't get any question, but you could wrap up.
So I got like many questions, but all in, they are like one question, which is, when we destroy the nation state, what do we do? And am I not putting into consideration social identities? What possibilities do we have? So recently, Yahya Seremba presented a paper at MISA and asked the question, how much of Uganda can we forge a future with? So I'm thinking of how much of Uganda can we forge a future with, and I'm taken to Mamdani, who tells us that what we need is to create a state where there is equal treatment of citizens, of all residents, regardless of our cultural attachments, a political environment where there is no privileged majority. So if we can do away with this majority, permanent majority, we shall have no political minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. Time is not on my side. Time is not on my side. Let me call Aventino to summarize his work. I gave him a question. I think he's following up on it.
Thank you, Professor. You asked me, how can the epistemological and the political coexist? And I think the question I was trying to grapple with in thinking through these two scholars was, where do the different conceptualization of the epistemic question take us? Where do we go? And I think from the presentation on nationism, you can see that if you connect this epistemological challenge to this nationalist project, then what you get is not just what Jacob presented in terms of this return to the nation as conceived, but also in epistemological terms, the imagination of pure Buganda, pure knowledge of Buganda, and so on. So I think the coexistence, again, I located it in Mamdani's text when he says that we have to link the two projects. We have to link the epistemological and the political. The epistemological has to service the political in a way. Thank you.
Give a big hand clap to my panel. Give another one to me. I thank you very much despite the constraints of time. But really the debate has been very fruitful, even to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for chairing this session, and thank you for the valiant effort made to keep time. I would like us to prepare for the next session, and as we do so, I would like to welcome the session chair for the next session, Dr. Florence Nansubuga. Please come and take your seat at the podium. The discussant for the next session, Professor Chikoma, please, you're welcome to take your seat. And the presenters for the next session, you're also welcome to take your seats. Dr. Balikowa, Dr. Anna